Open immediately. Your soulmate's secret love letter was finally found. Read the last page before it disappears. My beloved child. There is a letter your soulmate never expected you to see, and somehow, after all this time, it has finally been found. But what makes this strange isn't where it was hidden. It's what was written on the final page, and why that page was almost destroyed. The letter begins carefully, almost as if your soulmate was afraid that even the paper might reveal too much. They wrote about the first moment they realized their feelings for you had become impossible to ignore. They admitted there were nights when they wanted to reach out, when your name was already typed into their phone, but fear stopped them before they could send anything. Then comes one sentence that changes the entire tone. If you ever find this, you'll finally understand why I stayed silent. Don't skip. Because what follows isn't simply a confession of love. It's an explanation for a choice that may have confused you for longer than you realize. As the letter continues, something unexpected becomes clear. Your soulmate wasn't silent because they had forgotten you. They were silent because something happened that convinced them they might lose you completely if they revealed what was in their heart too soon. They describe watching from a distance, wondering whether you had already moved on, and questioning whether they still had a place in your life. But hidden between those lines is another clue. They mention a conversation, one you apparently never knew happened. Someone had said something about you that made your soulmate reconsider everything they believed. At first, they accepted those words as truth. Then they discovered one small detail that didn't fit. That detail pushed them to look deeper, and what they eventually learned left them ashamed that they had ever doubted you. From that moment, the letter stops sounding hesitant. The handwriting becomes more urgent. The sentences become shorter. And then your soulmate writes, "There is one thing I need you to know before it's too late." That should have been the confession. But it wasn't. There were still several lines remaining, followed by a final page folded separately from everything else. And that last page appears to have been written much later, because the words carry a completely different emotion. Your soulmate admits that they tried to convince themselves they could simply close this chapter and walk away. They couldn't. Certain memories kept returning. Certain words you once said suddenly meant more than they had understood at the time. And eventually, they realized the truth they had been avoiding. Their feelings hadn't disappeared, they had grown stronger in the silence. Stay till the end, because the final page contains the reason this letter was never delivered, and it isn't the reason you might expect. At the bottom, just before the writing abruptly stops, there is one unfinished sentence. "I kept this from you because the person who found out about us," and what comes immediately after those words may explain why this letter was hidden in the first place. The unfinished sentence was not an accident. Your soulmate had stopped writing because what came next was the one truth they were most afraid to put into permanent words. But farther down the page, squeezed into the margin as though added later, there was another line. "They told me you would be better without me, and for a while, I believed them." Suddenly, the silence begins to make sense. Someone had discovered how deeply your soulmate cared about you and planted a doubt at exactly the wrong moment. They suggested that reaching out would complicate your life, that you had already chosen another direction, and that confessing these feelings would only push you farther away. Your soulmate listened, not because their love was weak, but because they feared becoming a burden in your life. Yet one question kept haunting them: what if everything they had been told about you was wrong? That question eventually became impossible to ignore. Then something happened that shattered the story they had been given. Your soulmate came across something small, perhaps meaningless to anyone else, but unmistakable to them. It was connected to a memory only the two of you could fully understand. Suddenly, they began questioning every assumption that had kept them away. The letter says, "That was when I realized I had been making decisions based on someone else's version of your heart." Imagine the weight of that realization. They had spent all that time protecting themselves from a rejection that may never have existed. And once they understood this, regret rushed in. They remembered moments when you seemed to be waiting for them to say more. Conversations that ended too soon. Pauses that once felt awkward but now seemed filled with things neither of you dared to admit. Something huge is waiting for you, because this is where your soulmate reveals they almost contacted you immediately. But another discovery stopped them. Near the bottom of that hidden page, the handwriting changes again. Your soulmate writes that before reaching out, they needed to know one final thing: whether opening their heart would bring peace into your life or reopen something you had struggled to close. So they made a quiet decision. They would wait for one unmistakable sign that there was still something unfinished between you. Days passed. Then something occurred that they could not explain away as coincidence. It reminded them of you so strongly that they returned to this letter, unfolded the final page, and added several new sentences. Don't skip, because those sentences reveal that your soulmate had already decided what they would do if another opportunity appeared. But the most surprising detail is the final line they added beneath everything else. If you're reading this now, then somehow the secret I tried hardest to protect has already reached you, and there is one more thing you still don't know. That one remaining secret was the reason your soulmate had kept the letter instead of destroying it. Beneath the final line, written so lightly it could almost be missed, were 4 words: "I was coming back." Not someday. Not in some imaginary future. Your soulmate had already reached the point where silence no longer felt safe. The letter reveals that they had begun planning a conversation with you, rehearsing how they would explain the distance without sounding like they were making excuses. They wanted to tell you who had influenced their decision, what they had misunderstood, and why they disappeared behind their own fear instead of asking you directly. But there was something even more personal they wanted to confess. They had kept one memory of you alive through all of it. A tiny moment you probably never realized mattered. Whenever they tried to convince themselves the connection was finished, that memory returned. And strangely, it was connected to the very last page now sitting inside this letter. The memory wasn't dramatic. That was what made it powerful. Your soulmate remembered a moment when you looked at them differently, as if you were about to say something important but changed your mind. At the time, they dismissed it. Later, they replayed it endlessly. Your expression. The silence between you. The feeling that something had been left unfinished. In the letter, they admit, "I wondered whether you were waiting for me to be brave first." That question changed everything. Suddenly, they weren't only thinking about what they felt, they were wondering what you might have been hiding too. And that possibility terrified them more than rejection. Because if you had felt something and they walked away because of someone else's words, then the distance between you had been built on a misunderstanding. Stay till the end. Your soulmate then reveals that they wrote a second message, one far more direct than this letter, and almost sent it to you. But that second message never arrived. According to the final page, your soulmate deleted it at the last possible moment after noticing something that made them hesitate again. This time, however, it wasn't another person's warning. It was something connected directly to you. Something they saw made them wonder whether they had waited too long, whether your heart had finally closed the door they were preparing to knock on. Yet instead of giving up, they returned to the secret letter and wrote one final paragraph beneath everything else. The paper was nearly full now. There was barely enough room for the confession. And this is where the strangest detail appears. A section of that paragraph had been deliberately covered, as though someone had tried to make sure those particular words could never be read. Only the beginning remains visible. There is something I never told you about the day we, and underneath the covered words, one final sentence survives completely. If you knew what really happened that day, you would understand why I never stopped loving you. What really happened that day had been buried beneath silence for far too long. Your soulmate finally describes it in the narrow space beside the covered words, almost as if they returned later and couldn't bear leaving the truth hidden forever. That day, they had intended to tell you everything. They had already decided that whatever happened afterward, uncertainty was worse than hearing the truth from you. But shortly before they could speak, they overheard something that sounded unmistakably final. Your name was mentioned. So was the idea of moving forward without looking back. Your soulmate assumed those words reflected how you felt, and in that instant, every ounce of courage disappeared. What they didn't understand until much later was that the conversation had been taken completely out of context. The words weren't about rejecting them at all. And when they eventually discovered what you had actually meant, one painful question remained. How different would everything have been if they had simply stayed long enough to ask you? That realization explains why the letter feels almost desperate near the end. Your soulmate writes that they started remembering details from that day they had ignored because fear had already decided the meaning for them. The way you lingered before leaving. The way you seemed to turn back as though expecting them to say something. Even a simple sentence you spoke suddenly sounded different when replayed without all the assumptions surrounding it. Then comes another confession. I think we both walked away believing the other person had chosen to let go. That sentence changed the entire story. Two people may have been protecting themselves from the same imagined rejection. But your soulmate didn't stop there. They began searching through old memories, conversations, and moments they had dismissed. And one particular memory stood out so strongly that they wrote it twice in the margin. Don't skip, because it reveals why they never managed to throw this letter away. That memory was of a promise, not necessarily one spoken directly, but something your soulmate felt in the way you once treated them when they were vulnerable. They remembered feeling understood without needing to explain every emotion. And after everything that happened, that became the standard against which every attempt to move forward was measured. The letter admits they tried to forget. They removed reminders, avoided familiar places, and told themselves enough time would eventually make the connection feel ordinary. But one thing remained untouched, this letter. Every time they considered destroying it, they stopped at the final page. There was something written there that they weren't ready to lose. And now the strange part becomes clear. The covered section wasn't hiding a confession from you, it was hiding a decision your soulmate had made about you. Only 3 words from that decision can still be seen beneath the faded markings. When I return, what follows those words is still concealed, but the next line reveals something even bigger. Your soulmate had already chosen exactly what they wanted to say when they finally stood in front of you again. The words your soulmate planned to say were nothing like the careful sentences filling the earlier pages. By then, they were finished hiding behind uncertainty. In a tiny note beside, "When I return," they had written, "No more half-truths. No more letting fear speak for me." And suddenly, the purpose of the entire letter changes. It wasn't only a record of feelings they couldn't express. It had become preparation for a moment they genuinely believed would come. They wanted to stand before you without rehearsed excuses and admit that they had allowed assumptions to create distance where an honest conversation might have created something entirely different. But one sentence reveals how frightened they still were. "If your heart has changed, I will respect it. I just can't disappear without finally telling you what mine has been carrying." Then, directly beneath that, your soulmate mentions something they had never written anywhere else. A question they intended to ask you. That question wasn't simply, "Do you still love me?" Your soulmate knew feelings were more complicated than that. Instead, they wanted to ask whether there had ever been a moment when you almost reached for them too. They needed to know whether those unfinished conversations had lived only in their imagination or whether you had felt that strange hesitation as well. The letter describes several moments when they thought you might say something deeper, only for timing, fear, or circumstances to interrupt. Looking back, those moments no longer seemed accidental. Your soulmate writes, "Maybe we were both waiting for certainty when all we really needed was honesty." But then comes a detail that makes the letter even more mysterious. Someone apparently knew they were planning to return. Your soulmate doesn't identify the person immediately. They simply write that after making the decision, they received a message containing one sentence: "Before you go back, you need to know what really happened." That message sent them searching for an answer they hadn't even known was missing. At first, your soulmate expected another warning designed to keep them away from you. Instead, they were shown something connected to the misunderstanding that started everything. A forgotten detail. A piece of the original conversation. Proof that the story they had believed for so long had been incomplete. Suddenly, the covered words on the final page made sense. Someone had tried to protect a version of events that could not survive once the full truth appeared. Your soulmate writes that they sat silently after learning this, not angry at you, but stunned by how much time had been lost because neither of you possessed the whole story. Then they added one last note at the very edge of the page: "Now I know what I have to do." Don't skip what comes next, because immediately beneath those words is a date, and beside that date, your soulmate wrote exactly where they intended to go before finally bringing this secret into the open. The place written beside that date was not random. It was somewhere tied to the beginning of everything, somewhere your soulmate associated with the version of you they had never been able to forget. They chose it because they wanted the truth to come full circle. But next to the location was a strange instruction: bring the letter, but don't give it to them unless they ask the question. What question? That mystery hangs over the next several lines until your soulmate finally explains. They weren't looking for a perfect confession or some dramatic declaration from you. They were waiting to hear whether you would ask why they had really disappeared. If you asked that one thing, they would know there was still room for honesty between you. If you didn't, they planned to keep the letter hidden and accept that perhaps some truths arrived too late. Yet underneath that decision, another sentence had been added later: "I don't think I can leave without telling them anymore." Something had changed between writing those two lines. The cautious person who had spent page after page protecting their heart was beginning to understand that silence had already cost too much. Your soulmate admits they had imagined every possible outcome. You might be surprised. You might be guarded. You might tell them that too much time had passed. But there was one possibility they could no longer ignore: you might finally explain what that misunderstood conversation had actually meant. And if you did, the entire distance between you would suddenly have a different history. Then the letter reveals an even more startling detail. Your soulmate had prepared two endings for this final page. One was a goodbye they hoped they would never need. The other was left unfinished because they wanted to complete it only after speaking with you. Stay till the end, because the unfinished ending contains a blank space where your name was supposed to go. Below that blank space, your soulmate wrote only one complete sentence: "This is where our story either ends honestly or begins honestly." But before either ending could be completed, something interrupted the plan. A final note appears in different handwriting pressure, rushed and uneven, as though written moments before the letter was hidden again. Your soulmate says someone had discovered where the letter was being kept. They suddenly feared it might be taken, destroyed, or shown before they had the chance to explain it themselves. That is why the final page was separated. That is why certain words were covered. And that may be why this secret survived in fragments instead of reaching you directly. But there is one fragment we still haven't uncovered. On the back of the final page, beneath a fold that had apparently remained sealed, your soulmate left a last message beginning with 7 chillingly simple words: "If this reaches you before I do." What they wrote after that changes the meaning of the entire letter. Those 7 words were followed by the most vulnerable confession anywhere in the letter. "If this reaches you before I do, please don't mistake my silence for the absence of love." Your soulmate explains that every delay, every unsent message, and every moment of distance had been shaped by fear, not a lack of feeling. They feared arriving too late. They feared discovering that the door had closed. But most of all, they feared telling you the truth only to learn that the misunderstanding had already changed both of you beyond repair. Then the tone shifts. Your soulmate stops writing about what other people said or what went wrong and takes responsibility for the choice that belonged to them. "I should have asked you. I should have trusted what I knew about you instead of what I was told." For the first time, there is no mystery hiding behind those words. But just when the letter seems ready to end, one final folded corner reveals another sentence, one written after everything else. That sentence reads, "There is still something I haven't admitted, even here." And suddenly, the deepest secret isn't about the person who interfered, the misunderstood conversation, or even the reason your soulmate stayed away. It is about what they secretly hoped would happen after you learned everything. They confess that while part of them prepared for goodbye, Another part imagined sitting across from you and hearing your side from beginning to end. No interruptions. No assumptions. No one else interpreting your feelings for either of you. Just two people finally speaking honestly about what happened between them. Your soulmate didn't.